There are movies that entertain, and then there are movies that change everything. Batman, released in the summer of 1989, belongs firmly in the second category. But what most people sitting in those darkened theaters never knew was just how close this film came to never existing at all. The story behind Gotham's shadows is one of creative stubbornness, corporate fear, fan outrage, and dozens of decisions that could have gone wrong at any moment. This is not simply the story of a superhero movie. This is a story of production that nearly collapsed under the weight of its own ambition, survived against impossible odds, and then quietly rewrote the rules of an entire genre in the process. Long before a single camera rolled, Warner Brothers was already having second thoughts. The proposed tone was dark, moody, and unmistakably adult, and that made executives deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't the bright, campy Batman that television audiences had embraced. It was something genuinely new, and new meant unpredictable, and unpredictable meant financial risk. Budget concerns grew as the creative vision expanded, and at several critical moments, studio leadership seriously considered pulling the plug entirely. The film's darker direction clashed with everything executives believed mainstream audiences wanted from a superhero property. They worried about alienating families, losing merchandising opportunities, and backing a project that might never find its crowd. Internal debates stretched on for months, with different factions arguing over whether the gamble was even worth taking. Every major decision faced hesitation at the corporate level. What kept the production alive was a combination of creative persistence and shifting studio politics, with key producers fighting to protect the vision while carefully navigating layers of corporate resistance. Even so, the shadow of cancellation hung over the project well into pre-production, making it genuinely remarkable that audiences ever got to see it at all. Then came the announcement that set the internet on fire before the internet even existed. When news broke about who would wear the cape and cowl, fans didn't respond with excitement. They responded with organized, relentless fury. Thousands of letters flooded Warner Brothers, filled with outrage and disbelief. The chosen actor, Michael Keaton, was known primarily for comedy, and devoted comic book readers felt genuinely betrayed by what they saw as a fundamental misunderstanding of the character they loved. Studio executives watched the backlash escalate with growing alarm. Publications amplified the negativity. People inside the production began questioning whether the casting had been a catastrophic error. Confidence wavered at every level, and filming hadn't even started yet. What critics couldn't see was how completely the performance would eventually silence them. Keaton approached the role with intense psychological preparation, studying Batman's inner world with a depth that surprised everyone who witnessed it. But during those early months, none of that mattered to the public. The movie carried a cloud of doubt from its very first major announcement, and the entire team had to push forward knowing that millions already expected them to fail spectacularly. The director at the center of the storm was Tim Burton, a man whose previous success with Beetlejuice had earned him a seat at the table, but not quite enough trust to sit at its head. Executives admired his distinctive visual instincts, while simultaneously worrying that those same instincts might overwhelm a major franchise property. He was seen as an unpredictable artist whose ideas didn't always align with commercial logic. And throughout production, oversight followed him everywhere. Decisions that would normally rest comfortably with a director were second-guessed and endlessly debated. His preference for atmosphere over traditional action sequences raised constant concerns among studio representatives who remained on set, watching closely and reporting back to people who held the real power. The message was unmistakable. Trust had hard limits, and the creative leash was deliberately short. Despite this pressure, Burton pushed forward with his Gothic interpretation, filling Gotham with shadows, oddity, and a sense of decay that made executives genuinely uneasy, but ultimately defined the film's entire identity. What emerged was a compromise, but one where the director's fingerprints remained unmistakably visible in every frame, proving that even constrained creativity can produce something extraordinary. The screenplay, meanwhile, was something of a living document throughout the entire shoot. Stability was never part of the writing process. Pages arrived on set still warm from the printer. Scenes were rewritten overnight, restructured between takes, and sometimes abandoned entirely before anyone had a chance to fully execute them. Writers cycled through different drafts while production charged ahead, creating an atmosphere of perpetual uncertainty that tested everyone's patience and professionalism. Actors found themselves adapting constantly, with dialogue memorized one day, potentially gone the next. Entire sequences shifted in tone or purpose as the story was reshaped in real time. This created significant challenges for performance continuity, but also opened unexpected creative doors. Without a locked script, spontaneous choices sometimes replaced planned moments, adding texture and life that no writer had anticipated. Some of the film's most memorable beats emerged from this instability, born from necessity rather than design. But the constant changes also meant certain ideas never fully developed. Character arcs were trimmed, subplots vanished, and the final cut reflected compromises made under pressure. The screenplay that reached theaters was less a finished document than a snapshot of an evolving creative process. If the script created uncertainty, the costume created genuine physical suffering. The bat suit was designed for visual impact, not for human comfort or mobility, and wearing it came at a serious cost. Thick rubber encased the performer from neck to toe, trapping heat and restricting movement in ways that affected every single scene. Simply turning his head required rotating his entire torso, a physical limitation that fundamentally shaped how the character moved and presented himself on screen. Visibility inside the cowl was extremely limited, with peripheral vision essentially vanishing and making choreography difficult and situational awareness nearly impossible. Exhaustion set in quickly under hot studio lights, with the suit becoming a personal sauna during long shooting days. Breaks were necessary just to prevent overheating, slowing production and testing everyone's already strained patience. Rather than fight these constraints, the production leaned into them with remarkable creative intelligence. The deliberate, heavy movement became part of the character's imposing presence. What began as a design flaw was transformed into a stylistic choice that distinguished this version of Batman from anything audiences had seen before, turning physical limitation into artistic identity. While the actor suffered inside his rubber prison, designers were engaged in an equally ambitious struggle on the studio floors of Pinewood Studios, where they were building an entire city from scratch. Location scouts had searched extensively for streets and skylines that matched the production's vision, but nothing in the real world felt right. Gotham required a specific atmosphere, oppressive, timeless, and fundamentally unreal, and the decision was made to construct it entirely by hand. Enormous sets rose from studio floors featuring towering buildings, narrow alleyways, and layered architecture that blended decades of design influence while committing to any single era. Gothic cathedrals stood beside Art Deco facades. Industrial decay pressed against classical stonework. Nothing about Gotham suggested a specific time period, and that was entirely by design. The city needed to feel eternal, trapped in its own dark internal logic. Cost ballooned as construction continued, adding financial pressure to an already tense production, but filmmakers insisted the investment was essential. Every frame carried a handcrafted quality that would have been impossible to achieve on location. Gotham became more than a backdrop. It became a character in its own right, looming over the story with genuine physical presence and setting a new standard for comic book world building that would influence productions for decades. Not every creative battle was fought between Burton and nervous executives. Some conflict arrived from entirely unexpected directions. When Prince joined the project as a musical contributor, the arrangement came from corporate levels well above the filmmakers. Time Warner executives saw a cross-promotional opportunity too good to ignore, a blockbuster film paired with a chart-topping album from one of music's biggest stars. The business logic was undeniable, even if the creative friction it generated would simmer throughout the production. Burton resisted the pairing from the start, having envisioned a darker orchestral soundscape that matched Gotham's gothic atmosphere. Prince's pop stylings felt jarringly out of place to him, threatening the cohesive mood he had worked so carefully to establish. But the decision wasn't his to make. Corporate machinery had already set the collaboration in motion, and producers pushed forward despite the director's objections. Burton found himself overruled on a fundamental creative element, a rare but sharp illustration of where true power actually resided in major Hollywood productions. Prince delivered energetic tracks that became hits independent of the film, but their integration within the narrative remained genuinely awkward. The soundtrack battle illustrated how blockbuster productions often serve multiple commercial masters simultaneously, with artistic visions sometimes bending to strategies that have nothing to do with storytelling. As filming progressed, Something quietly unexpected was happening with the story itself. What had begun as a hero's journey was gradually transforming into something else entirely. Scene by scene, the Joker's presence expanded, his screen time growing while the protagonist receded further into the shadows. Jack Nicholson's theatrical energy proved simply irresistible, and the production increasingly leaned into that magnetic chaos. Part of this shift was contractual, with certain agreements guaranteeing prominent placement and creative influence that shaped how scenes were written and staged. But beyond contracts, there was undeniable screen chemistry that directors and editors recognized and responded to, expanding sequences that showcased the villain's chaos while trimming quieter moments elsewhere. The result was a film where the antagonist frequently overshadowed the title character, a dynamic that divided critics and audiences but ultimately influenced countless comic book adaptations that followed. Some felt the hero had become a supporting player in his own story. Others embraced the villain's dominance as the film's greatest strength. Either way, the narrative center had quietly migrated, and the genre would never be quite the same. Among the many things that made Nicholson's performance so electrically alive was the degree to which it was shaped by improvisation. Not everything memorable in the film came from the written page. Some of the most quoted lines and striking visual gestures emerged spontaneously during shooting, with performers bringing personal instincts to their roles and testing boundaries in ways that no writer had planned. The atmosphere of constant script changes actually encouraged this experimentation, creating space for performers to take genuine creative ownership. Small physical choices, a particular gesture, a vocal inflection, accumulated into something larger and stranger than the written role had suggested. Directors recognized the value in these moments and allowed space for spontaneity, keeping cameras rolling even when actors went off script in interesting directions. The willingness to embrace creative accidents shaped the final product in subtle but significant ways, with moments that feel iconic today having been discovered through trial and risk rather than careful planning. This flexibility required deep trust between performers and filmmakers, especially given the chaotic conditions surrounding the entire production. While improvisation added texture performances, time was relentlessly stripping it away from everything else. From the beginning, the production faced aggressive deadlines that left almost no room for error. Release dates were locked, marketing campaigns were planned, and the machinery of a major studio rollout waited for absolutely no one. Every delay on set rippled forward, compressing the time available for everything that followed. Creative ambition constantly collided with practical reality, with elaborate sequences being simplified when schedules tightened and scenes requiring extensive setup being compressed or entirely reimagined to save precious hours. The crew worked grueling days, pushing through exhaustion to meet targets that always seemed just out of reach. Despite these pressures, the team found ways to protect what mattered most, with key sequences receiving the attention they deserved even when it meant sacrificing elsewhere. The finished film bears traces of these compromises and moments that feel slightly rushed alongside others given full creative treatment. But the relentless schedule also forced efficiency and decisiveness, eliminating endless deliberation and producing committed choices that gave the film much of its driving momentum. Even as the film was being made, its darkness remained under constant threat of being diluted. Studio executives watching early footage grew increasingly concerned that what they were seeing was too dark for the mainstream audience they needed to attract. Families brought children to superhero films. Merchandise needed broad appeal. A movie steeped in shadow and menace didn't fit the established commercial template, and pressure mounted to soften its edges before it was too late. Several sequences drew particular scrutiny, with violence that felt essential to the filmmakers striking executives as potentially excessive. Notes arrived requesting changes. Lighter moments here, reduced intensity there. Some ideas were rewritten before cameras rolled, while others were trimmed in editing. The creative team pushed back where they could, defending their vision against corporate caution with varying degrees of success. What survived was a careful negotiation, retaining enough darkness to feel genuinely distinct and mature while staying within boundaries that studio executives could accept. That tension between edge and accessibility became part of the film's identity, giving it real bite while remaining within studio tolerance. The visual approach was equally unconventional and equally contested. Conventional cinematography was abandoned in favor of something that had no real precedent in the superhero genre. Traditional comic book films favored clarity and bright colors, with heroes plainly visible and action sequences photographed for maximum legibility. This production chose a fundamentally different path. Shadows dominated the visual language, swallowing characters and environments alike. Silhouettes replaced detailed figures. Extreme angles created disorientation and unease. Pools of light emerged from total blackness, drawing the eye while leaving surroundings mysterious and threatening. The commitment to atmosphere over clarity gave the film a distinctive identity that separated it from everything before it, and audiences had never seen a comic book adaptation that looked quite like this. Critics noticed and debated the boldness, with some celebrating it as a genuine artistic achievement, and others arguing it undermined the spectacle audiences had come to expect. But the visual signature became inseparable from the film's cultural identity, remembered and discussed for decades. While filmmakers fought to maintain their artistic vision, other forces were shaping production from directions no one had anticipated. Merchandising conversations began long before filming wrapped, with executives understanding that action figures, lunchboxes, and apparel would generate revenue streams potentially rivaling the box office itself. That commercial reality quietly influenced creative decisions in ways audiences never saw. Designs were evaluated not just for screen impact, but for how well they would translate into plastic and fabric. The iconic logo received particular attention, refined until it worked equally well on film and on store shelves. These conversations happened in meetings far removed from sound stages, where financial projections carried as much weight as artistic instincts. Designers who had crafted elements for purely visual impact found modifications arriving from unexpected commercial directions. The final designs reflected this ongoing push and pull, striking enough to define the film's look while functional enough to drive merchandise sales, a reminder that blockbuster filmmaking serves commercial ecosystems extending far beyond the theater doors. The physical constraints of the costume had already fundamentally altered the film's action sequences, but the full extent of that influence deserves its own consideration. Fight choreography faced immediate and severe limitations. Rapid movements, martial arts sequences, and athletic combat were simply not possible given the physical realities of the suit. Stunt coordinators had to completely rethink their approach, abandoning speed and agility in favor of power and deliberation. Strikes landed heavy rather than fast. Movement carried weight and inevitability rather than grace or athleticism. Camera angles and editing were used creatively to sell impacts that couldn't rely on complex choreography. The result was action that felt genuinely different from anything else in the genre, slower perhaps, but more grounded and more physically credible. What had begun as an inescapable limitation evolved into a defining stylistic choice, demonstrating how creative problem-solving can transform obstacles into signature elements that audiences ultimately embrace and celebrate. Even the film's ending generated significant executive anxiety during the final stages of production. What they saw in early cuts didn't offer clean resolution or triumphant celebration. It lingered in shadow, leaving emotional threads unresolved and characters damaged rather than restored. For a tentpole release carrying massive financial expectations, this felt unnecessarily risky. Notes arrived exploring alternatives. Could the ending feel more uplifting? Should victories be clearer and losses less ambiguous? The creative team argued that the ending's weight was essential to the story's integrity, that pulling back would undermine everything the film had built. Ultimately, the conclusion survived largely intact, with only minor adjustments made to its fundamental tone. The film closed with its shadows unlifted, its heroes still haunted, its world still dangerous. Preview audiences and critics would later validate this choice, but during production, that confidence simply didn't exist. The ending represented one final gamble in a project filled with them, defended by filmmakers who genuinely believed audiences could handle more than studios were prepared to assume. Throughout all of this creative and corporate turbulence, many of the people actually building the film were working with incomplete information. Scripts changed constantly and secrecy surrounded key plot points, leaving many crew members operating with only fragments of the larger picture. Set decorators designed spaces without fully understanding what scenes would unfold there. Costume departments prepared options without certainty about which would be needed. Communication breakdowns led to redundant work and last-minute scrambles. Yet something remarkable emerged from this disorder. Forced to work with incomplete information, crew members made independent creative choices that sometimes exceeded what might have been specifically requested. Improvised solutions became permanent features. Designs created on pure instinct aligned with the film's tone better than deliberate planning might have achieved. The chaos that frustrated so many people also liberated them, creating space for unexpected brilliance to emerge from conditions that easily could produce only dysfunction and confusion. Late in post-production, a new thread emerged from a direction the creative team could not control. Classification boards hold enormous power over commercial prospects, and concerns grew that certain sequences might trigger a restrictive rating that would limit audiences and devastate merchandising aimed at younger buyers. Editors faced difficult choices under mounting pressure, trimming frames, softening impacts, and removing certain shots entirely in pursuit of classification that would allow broad release. The version audiences ultimately saw represented careful calibration, dark enough to feel genuinely dangerous, restrained enough to secure the access the studio needed. Some footage that existed in early cuts never reached theaters, sacrificed permanently to satisfy external requirements. The marketing campaign that preceded the film's release was itself a quiet masterpiece of damage control. Early promotional materials featured the iconic logo dominating black backgrounds. Trailers emphasized atmosphere in Gotham's shadowy streets, while conspicuously avoiding prominent display of the lead actor's face. This was strategic response to the casting backlash, with marketers understanding that featuring Keaton prominently risked reigniting anger among the very audiences they needed to attract. The symbol became the star, allowing audiences to embrace the concept before confronting their lingering doubts about who wore the cape. The approach worked remarkably well, with anticipation building around mystery rather than star power. By opening night, the controversy had faded enough that the performance could finally speak entirely for itself. When the film was released, the cultural response exceeded nearly every expectation that had survived the production's turbulent journey. Critics were divided, which itself surprised executives who had anticipated either clear triumph or obvious failure rather than this complicated middle ground where genuine praise and pointed criticism existed simultaneously. Strong box office numbers offered reassurance, but what emerged over time was a deeper recognition that divided reactions didn't mean failure. Audiences packed theaters regardless of critical ambivalence, drawn by curiosity and word of mouth. The controversy itself had generated conversation that fueled ticket sales in ways traditional marketing couldn't have manufactured. The film's ultimate legacy, however, extends far beyond any single opening weekend or critical assessment. Before 1989, comic book adaptations followed predictable patterns centered on bright colors and family-friendly adventure. Darkness was considered commercially dangerous. The success that followed Batman's release rewrote those assumptions permanently, demonstrating that audiences would embrace mature, atmospheric interpretations of characters they had known and loved since childhood. Development meetings across Hollywood suddenly included discussions about tone and adult appeal that would have seemed commercially foolish just months earlier. The template for superhero filmmaking expanded almost overnight to include approaches prioritizing psychological complexity over simple spectacle. Every subsequent adaptation exists in conversation with what this film established and proved possible. Darker interpretations became not just acceptable, but expected from certain properties. The visual language, the tonal ambitions, the willingness to prioritize mood and atmosphere over conventional action all became legitimate options for filmmakers who followed in its wake. What arrived in 1989 didn't just succeed on its own considerable terms. It expanded the creative territory available to an entire genre, ensuring that future generations of filmmakers would inherit possibilities that simply hadn't existed before Gotham's shadows first reached theater screens worldwide. Batman didn't succeed because it played things safe. It succeeded because it survived everything working against it, emerged with its essential vision largely intact, and then proved that audiences were ready for something that studios had been too afraid to give them. The shadows that defined Gotham also hid the struggles that shaped every frame. Behind the Gothic architecture and iconic performances lay a production that nearly collapsed multiple times, a testament to the stubbornness of creative vision, and the remarkable things that become possible when the right people refuse to back down. Sonnet 4.6